On Friday, September 13th, 1985, a 34-year-old woman named Helen Vance walked out of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, with 7 classified documents taped to the small of her back beneath her blouse. The next afternoon, those documents would begin their journey to Moscow, transferred during the chaos of a Kmart blue light special in Springfield, Virginia. Within 72 hours, they would be sitting on a desk at KGB headquarters, having traveled through a network so embedded in the fabric of American suburban life that it had operated undetected for nearly 18 months. Helen Vance had not set out to become a traitor. Born in 1951 in Akron, Ohio, to a middle-class family, she was the middle child of 3, described by her high school teachers as diligent and organized. She attended Ohio State University, majoring in science, and graduated in 1973 with respectable grades and no particular ambitions beyond finding stable work. In 1974, she applied for a position as a documentation clerk at the Central Intelligence Agency, drawn by the promise of good benefits and steady employment. The hiring process took 7 months. She underwent extensive background checks, polygraph examinations, and interviews that probed every detail of her life. The investigators found nothing of concern. She was exactly the kind of person the CIA wanted in its administrative ranks: reliable, forgettable, and absolutely trustworthy. In June 1974, she received her security clearance and began work in a windowless office where her primary responsibilities involved cataloging, filing, and occasionally reproducing classified materials for distribution to authorized personnel. For the first decade of her employment, there was nothing in Helen Vance's behavior to suggest anything other than ordinary dedication. She arrived on time, maintained meticulous records, and socialized just enough to avoid seeming antisocial. She lived alone in a modest 1-bedroom apartment in Arlington, drove a 1979 Honda Civic, and stretched her $24,000 annual salary far enough to maintain a comfortable, if unexciting, existence. The financial pressure began in March 1984, when Helen's father suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to work. Her mother could not manage his care alone. Helen's older brother lived in California with mounting student loan debt, while her younger sister was working as a waitress in Cleveland and barely making rent. The responsibility fell to Helen. She began sending money home, $300 a month at first, then $500, then $700 as medical bills accumulated. She took out personal loans and opened new credit cards in an increasingly desperate attempt to stay afloat. By the spring of 1984, Helen Vance was $31,000 in debt and drowning. She could not ask for a raise. Her position was governed by strict civil service pay scales. She could not take a second job. Her security clearance required reporting any outside employment. She could not declare bankruptcy without triggering a security review. She felt trapped, suffocated by obligations she had never asked for, but could not bring herself to abandon. And in that suffocation, in that particular combination of financial desperation and access to valuable information, the seed of betrayal found fertile ground. The initial contact came on June 7th, 1984. Helen was shopping at her usual Kmart on a Thursday evening when a man in his late 40s with graying hair struck up a conversation. He said he was new to the area and introduced himself as Robert Wilson. He said he worked in IT consulting, and when Helen mentioned she worked for the government, his interest seemed polite and professional, nothing more. She saw him again 3 weeks later in the housewares aisle. The conversation lasted longer this time, drifting naturally toward the cost of living in Northern Virginia, how expensive everything was, how hard it was to get ahead. Helen found herself confiding about her parents' situation, about the financial pressure. Robert Wilson listened with what seemed like genuine sympathy. The third encounter, on July 19, 1984, was not an accident, though Helen did not know this. They walked through the store together, and he suggested coffee. They went to a Denny's 2 blocks away and talked for 90 minutes. He asked gentle questions about her work, nothing that seemed intrusive. Helen, starved for connection and worn down by stress, found herself talking more openly than she had intended. At the end of their conversation, Robert Wilson made his move with careful precision. He said he sometimes did freelance consulting work for various organizations, research and information gathering, and he knew people who would pay good money for insights into how government documentation systems worked. If she was ever interested in making extra money, he could set something up. He wrote a phone number on a napkin, pushed it across the table, told her to think about it. Helen Vance took the napkin and put it in her wallet. She did not call the number for 18 days. During those 18 days, she learned that her father needed a specialized wheelchair that insurance would not cover, and that the cost would be $4,200. She sat at her kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of credit card statements and the napkin with Robert Wilson's phone number, and she made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life. She called the number on August 6, 1984. The arrangement was established with remarkable efficiency. Robert Wilson, whose real name was Boris Vetronov and who worked for the KGB's first chief directorate out of the Soviet embassy in Washington, met Helen Vance at a park in Alexandria on August 11th. They sat on a bench overlooking the Potomac River, and he explained what he needed with perfect clarity. He needed classified documents, actual materials that passed through her hands at the CIA. He would pay $2,000 per document initially, with the rate increasing based on the value of the material. Helen Vance should have stood up and walked away, but she did not. She sat on that bench and listened, as Boris Vetronov explained the mechanics of espionage with casual efficiency. The money was the primary motivation, she later testified, but there was something else too. There was a strange exhilaration in being asked, in being seen as someone valuable enough to recruit, in having power over something for the first time in a life defined by powerlessness. She agreed to his terms. They discussed methodology. Helen could not simply walk out of Langley with classified documents in a bag or briefcase. Security personnel routinely checked such items, and even in 1984, the random inspections were frequent enough to make that method suicidal. But she could carry documents on her body. Vetronov provided her with medical tape and specific instructions. Documents were to be folded twice, taped against the small of her back, or, for smaller materials, against the inside of her thigh. The placement was deliberate. Security guards at Langley rarely conducted physical searches of personnel, and certainly never strip searches without probable cause. As a documentation clerk, she had legitimate access to photocopiers, and she had learned over a decade exactly when security personnel were least attentive and which times of day offered the most cover. She would make copies during her legitimate work, tape them to her body, and walk out. Once at home, she would photograph the documents with a 35mm camera Vetronov provided, then destroy the photocopies. The transfer method required creativity. Vetronov could not simply meet her regularly at predetermined locations. Such patterns were too easily detected by FBI surveillance teams. What they needed was a method embedded within the natural flow of American suburban life. The solution came from Helen herself. She mentioned that she shopped at Kmart almost every Saturday afternoon. Vetronov immediately recognized the potential. Kmart stores in the mid-1980s were sprawling retail environments with constant customer traffic and minimal security. Even better, Kmart had its Blue Light Special. The Blue Light Special had been introduced by Kmart in 1965 as a way to create excitement in its stores. At random intervals throughout the day, a store employee would turn on a rotating blue police-style beacon light mounted on a pole and announce over the public address system that a special discount was available on specific merchandise for a limited time, usually 15 minutes. The announcement would trigger a surge of customers rushing to the location of the blue light, creating a brief moment of concentrated activity and controlled chaos. By the mid-1980s, the blue light special had become so ingrained in American consumer culture that it was recognized by virtually every suburban shopper in the country. For espionage purposes, the blue light special was nearly perfect. The surges of customer traffic provided natural cover for brief encounters. The timing was unpredictable, which meant any meeting would appear spontaneous rather than pre-planned. And because Helen legitimately shopped at Kmart every Saturday, her presence would never seem suspicious. Vetronoff refined the method. They would meet on alternating Saturdays, but only during the blue light special that occurred right after 2 p.m. Helen would browse normally, carrying the film canister in her purse. When a blue light special was announced, she would make her way to the designated area. Vetronoff would also move toward the blue light. The actual transfer would occur in the brief crush of activity. A purse brushed against a shopping basket, a film canister passed in less than 3 seconds, visually indistinguishable from the normal jostling of shoppers competing for bargains. They tested the method on August 25, 1984, using blank film. It worked perfectly. Vetronoff gave Helen $1,000 in cash and told her to begin photographing documents. The first classified documents Helen Vance photographed were dated September 4th and 5th, 1984, and concerned CIA assessments of Soviet military aid to Nicaragua's Sandinista government. As a documentation clerk, Helen did not have access to the most sensitive materials, but she had access to a vast middle tier of classified information, operational cables, and analytical reports that formed the working infrastructure of intelligence operations. On Thursday, September 6th, during her lunch break, Helen used one of the copy rooms on the 3rd floor to reproduce 6 pages of material. She waited until 1:15 p.m., made her copies quickly, folded them twice, and taped them to the small of her back beneath her blouse. She walked out of Langley that evening, the documents pressed against her skin, and drove home, where she spent 2 hours photographing them using the camera that Vetronoff had provided. The camera itself was hidden inside a hollowed-out dictionary on her bookshelf, while the exposed film was concealed in her freezer, tucked inside a bag of frozen peas, where the cold would preserve the emulsion and prevent the latent images from degrading. Saturday, September 8th, 1984, was humid and overcast. Helen arrived at the Kmart on Backlick Road just before 2 p.m., the film canister secured in her purse. At 2:31 p.m., the announcement came, "Attention Kmart shoppers, we have a blue light special in our small appliances section for the next 15 minutes. Helen made her way toward the back of the store, where perhaps 15 people were already gathered. Vetronoff was there, wearing different clothes than she had seen him in before, carrying a small shopping basket. Helen positioned herself near the coffee makers, her right hand resting on her purse. Vetronoff moved closer, reaching for a coffee maker on the shelf above where Helen was standing, and as he extended his arm, his basket came within inches of her purse. The film canister slipped from her purse into the basket, a motion that took perhaps 2 seconds. Vetronoff moved away immediately, while Helen remained at the display for another 3 minutes. The transfer had been so smooth, so unremarkable, that it was almost disappointing. She had simply moved through a suburban retail space and committed espionage that had been visually indistinguishable from buying discount merchandise. 3 days later, she found an envelope in her mailbox containing $14,000 in cash. Helen Vance stared at the money, more cash than she had ever held, and felt the full weight of what she had done. She paid off 2 credit cards, sent $3,000 to her mother, and deposited the rest in a new savings account. Over the following months, the pattern established itself with mechanical regularity. Helen would photograph documents during the week. Every other Saturday, during a blue light special, she would pass a film canister to Vetronov. The payments arrived reliably, and the amounts increased. By December 1984, Helen was being paid $3,000 per document. By March 1985, certain materials commanded $5,000. The documents Helen Vance provided to Soviet intelligence between September 1984 and December 1985 represented a significant compromise. She passed information concerning CIA operations in Afghanistan, surveillance reports detailing FBI monitoring of Soviet diplomatic personnel, assessments of Soviet military capabilities in Eastern Europe, and the names of 3 CIA assets operating in East Germany, information that would result in their arrests by the Stasi. Helen knew the documents were damaging. She read what she photographed. She understood the intelligence she provided allowed the Soviet Union to counter American operations and neutralize individuals working against them. But she did not stop. The money had become necessary, integrated into her life in ways that made it impossible to disentangle without collapse. More than the money, there was momentum. The way each successful transfer made the next seem more routine, less transgressive. The blue light special transfers became a strange ritual. Every other Saturday, she would drive to Kmart, shop normally, wait for the discount announcement, and complete the transfer amid suburban shoppers hunting for bargains. The locations varied: housewares one week, sporting goods the next, electronics, toys. The merchandise changed, but the method remained constant. On November 17, 1984, Helen passed documents concerning CIA infiltration of Soviet secure communications during a blue light special on bathroom fixtures. On January 12, 1985, she passed satellite reconnaissance schedules during a blue light special on women's winter coats. On March 23, 1985, she passed assessments of Soviet biological weapons research during a blue light special on children's toys. Each transfer was completed in seconds, invisible to any organized surveillance. But Helen Vance was not invisible. By late spring 1985, she had attracted the attention of the CIA's Office of Security. In April 1985, during a routine security review, investigators found something unexpected. Credit cards that had carried significant balances were suddenly paid off. A woman earning $27,000 a year had somehow eliminated $31,000 in debt in less than 8 months. When investigators checked her family and tax filings, they found no evidence of any legitimate windfall. The money had come from somewhere unknown, and unknown sources of money for someone with access to classified information were among the most significant red flags in counterintelligence work. On June 3, 1985, the Office of Security opened a preliminary inquiry. By July 1985, it had been upgraded to a full counterintelligence investigation, and the FBI was brought in. On July 22, 1985, they began physical surveillance of Helen Vance. The FBI surveillance was comprehensive, but not immediately productive. Agents followed her daily routines and found no obvious meetings with foreign intelligence officers. For the first 3 weeks, Helen Vance appeared to be exactly what her personnel file suggested: a quiet, unremarkable government employee. The breakthrough came from patient observation. On August 10, 1985, FBI Special Agent Jennifer Caldwell was reviewing surveillance logs and noticed that Helen went to the same Kmart store every Saturday afternoon. Caldwell cross-referenced these visits with a database tracking Soviet intelligence officers in Washington. On 4 Saturdays when Helen had been at Kmart, a Soviet embassy official named Boris Vetronov had been documented in the general vicinity of Springfield. Vetronov was a known KGB officer operating undercover as a cultural attaché. The correlation could have been coincidence, but in counterintelligence work, repeated coincidences were never assumed innocent. The FBI established intensive surveillance on Helen's Saturday Kmart visits. On August 17, 1985, they deployed 6 agents throughout the store, disguised as shoppers. 2 additional agents sat in an unmarked sedan in the parking lot, taking photographs with telephoto lenses. At 2:38 p.m., a blue light special was announced on kitchen towels. Special Agent Thomas Reeves watched Helen examine towels alongside other shoppers. He noted brief physical contact with another shopper, but the contact was so fleeting he could not determine if anything had been passed. The breakthrough came from the parking lot team. Agent Michael Chen, reviewing photographs, identified one man whose timing was suspicious. The man had entered 8 minutes after Helen and exited 12 minutes after the blue light special ended. The man in the photograph was Boris Vetronov. On August 20th, 1985, the surveillance operation was upgraded to a full counterintelligence task force. The decision was made. They would not arrest Helen immediately, but would monitor her closely and use her as a window into Soviet intelligence operations. The surveillance intensified. FBI agents began arriving before Helen on Saturdays, positioning themselves strategically. They placed tracking devices underneath her Honda Civic. They obtained warrants to monitor her telephone and conduct black bag jobs, surreptitious entries into her apartment while she was away at work. The FBI documented 2 more transfers on August 31st and September 14th. The black bag jobs yielded damning evidence: a 35mm camera with a specialized copy stand hidden inside a hollowed-out dictionary on her bookshelf, rolls of undeveloped film concealed inside a bag of frozen peas in her freezer, and bank statements showing cash deposits totaling approximately $73,000. By mid-September 1985, the FBI had assembled a comprehensive case. They had documentation of Helen's pattern coinciding with Soviet intelligence officers. They had observed suspicious contact during blue light specials. They had found document photography equipment and unexplained cash. What they lacked was direct observation of an actual transfer with sufficient clarity for prosecution. The challenge was significant. The blue light special created controlled chaos. During the 15-minute windows, 30 or 40 shoppers would converge on a single area, creating a mass of bodies that made clean sight lines impossible. FBI agents had to maintain cover while trying to observe a 2-second hand movement through a crowd. The FBI's frustration grew through October and November. They were certain Helen was passing documents, but they could not document the transfer with prosecution-level clarity. The decision was made in late November to attempt a more aggressive operation. The next expected transfer would occur on Saturday, December 7th, 1985. The FBI planned to deploy 12 agents in the store and 4 in the parking lot. Saturday, December 7th, 1985, was cold and clear. Helen Vance left her apartment and drove to the Kmart on Backlick Road. FBI surveillance teams had been in position since noon. Special Agent Jennifer Caldwell coordinated from an unmarked van, communicating with her team through concealed radio earpieces. Helen entered the store and deviated from her normal pattern. Instead of browsing through clothing or housewares, she went directly to the pharmacy section and appeared to be waiting. FBI agents noted the change with concern. Agent Thomas Reeves watched Helen pretend to read vitamin bottle labels while repeatedly glancing at her watch. At 2:31 p.m., the announcement came. The cheerful voice over the public address system, "Attention Kmart shoppers." It declared a blue light special in the housewares department. Helen immediately began walking toward housewares with purpose. FBI agents converged from multiple directions. The blue light was rotating, and shoppers were gathering around the Corningware display. Helen positioned herself near the edge of the crowd, holding her purse close. Agent Caldwell managed to enter the section just behind Helen. Caldwell watched Helen's hands, watched her right hand rest on her purse in a way that seemed deliberate. The crowd grew to perhaps 30 people. Then Boris Vetronov entered from the opposite end, carrying a small shopping basket and wearing a Baltimore Orioles cap and brown jacket. Caldwell felt her pulse accelerate. She touched the microphone concealed in her collar, transmitting a single word to alert the other agents. Vetronov reached the edge of the crowd near Helen. He appeared to be reaching for a cookware set on a shelf above the display, stretching his arm upward. And as he did so, his shopping basket swung toward Helen's position. Helen's hand moved, a motion that Caldwell saw with perfect clarity. Watching Helen's fingers dip into her purse and withdraw a small cylindrical object. Watching that object move toward Vetronov's basket in a smooth, practiced motion. Caldwell saw the film canister pass from Helen's hand into Vetronov's basket. She saw it clearly enough to testify to it in court. She touched her microphone again, transmitting confirmation of the transfer to the entire team. But Caldwell did not give the order to move in immediately. Vetronov, as a registered diplomat, could not be arrested without creating a diplomatic incident. The arrest would focus entirely on Helen Vance, and the timing needed to be managed carefully. Caldwell allowed them to separate. Vetronov moved away immediately, walking toward the front of the store. Helen remained at the blue light special for another 2 minutes, examining cookware, maintaining her cover. Then she too moved away, browsing through women's clothing for several minutes before heading toward the exit. Helen walked through the automatic doors at 2:54 p.m. and crossed the parking lot toward her Honda Civic. She unlocked the driver's side door and was reaching to open it when Special Agent Jennifer Caldwell approached from behind, flanked by 2 other agents. Caldwell held up her FBI credentials at eye level, the gold badge catching the December sunlight, and identified herself by name and agency. The request was calm but firm, asking Helen to step away from the vehicle. There was no dramatic confrontation, no struggle, no raised voices. Other shoppers loading groceries into their cars barely noticed the interaction. Helen's face lost all color. She stood very still for a moment, then complied, stepping back from the car. She did not ask what this was about. She did not protest or deny. She simply allowed herself to be escorted to an unmarked sedan parked 3 rows away, was read her Miranda rights, and was transported to the FBI's Washington field office, while other agents remained behind to secure her vehicle. Simultaneously, other agents followed Vetronov as he left the store and got into his vehicle. They photographed him, placing the shopping basket in his trunk, and followed him back toward the Soviet embassy. Vetronov would be declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States on December 12, 1985, 5 days after the arrest. Helen Vance was placed in an interrogation room and left alone for nearly an hour, standard procedure designed to allow the reality of the situation to settle over a suspect. When Special Agents Caldwell and Reeves entered at 4:15 p.m., they found Helen sitting with her head in her hands. The interrogation was recorded on audio tape, and Caldwell began by confirming that Helen understood her rights and that anything discussed could be used as evidence. The agents laid out what they knew. They had been conducting surveillance for months. They knew about the documents, knew about Vetronov, knew about the Kmart transfers. They had witnessed the transfer that afternoon, had other agents who witnessed it, and had enough evidence to charge her with espionage under the Espionage Act. The question now was whether Helen was willing to cooperate with the investigation. There was a long silence. Helen wiped her eyes and made the decision to cooperate fully. Over the following 6 hours, Helen Vance provided a complete confession detailing every aspect of her espionage activities from June 1984 through the transfer that had occurred hours earlier. She described the financial pressures, the recruitment, the method of using blue light specials as cover. She provided dates of every transfer she could remember, approximately 32 separate occasions over 16 months. She described which documents she had photographed and passed, providing enough detail that CIA damage assessment teams would later be able to reconstruct much of the compromise. She acknowledged receiving approximately $127,000 in cash payments over the 16-month period. She had done it for money, she stated, and she had done it knowingly, and she expressed remorse for her actions. Helen Vance was formally charged on December 9, 1985, with multiple counts of espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, and unauthorized disclosure of classified information. The charges carried a potential sentence of life in prison. She was denied bail and held at a federal detention facility in West Virginia. The CIA's damage assessment determined that Helen's espionage had resulted in significant harm. The documents she had passed included information that led directly to the arrest and imprisonment of 3 CIA assets in East Germany. One received 15 years in prison. Helen had also compromised CIA operations in Afghanistan and FBI surveillance of Soviet diplomatic personnel. In February 1986, Helen's attorney negotiated a plea agreement. Helen agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a recommendation of 25 years rather than life imprisonment. The agreement required her complete cooperation with damage assessment efforts. On March 14, 1986, she appeared in federal court and pleaded guilty. The sentencing hearing occurred on May 2, 1986. The courtroom was closed to the public because portions involved classified information. Federal District Court Judge Harold Pearson sentenced Helen Vance to 30 years in federal prison, 5 years more than recommended. The judge acknowledged Helen's cooperation and lack of ideological motivation, but emphasized that the severity of the harm warranted a sentence that would send a clear message about the consequences of betraying national security. Helen Vance served her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Alderson, West Virginia. She was a model prisoner, caused no disciplinary problems, and worked in the prison library. She was released via mandatory release after 20 years in June 2006 at age 55. After her release, Helen moved to a small town in Pennsylvania where she worked at a public library. She lived quietly, spoke rarely about her past, and made no attempts to profit from her notoriety. She died in November 2019 at age 68 from complications related to lung cancer. Boris Vetronov was expelled from the United States on December 12, 1985, and returned to Moscow. He was reportedly promoted within the KGB for his successful recruitment and operation of Helen. The Kmart store on Backlick Road, where the transfers occurred, continued operating until 2002, when it closed as part of Kmart's corporate restructuring during bankruptcy proceedings. The Blue Light Special program itself was discontinued by Kmart in 1991, briefly revived in 2001, and then ended permanently. the blue rotating lights that had once been such an iconic part of American shopping culture became artifacts of retail history.